Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. We're really excited about this event. We hope it will be really helpful for people. As I said, we're the Sick Times, a nonprofit news publication covering long COVID and related diseases. And we're having this webinar today to talk about op-eds and essays on long COVID and more broadly, how to share your story with a broader audience. We are a nonprofit news outlet. We produce news stories as well as essays and op-eds covering everything from the latest scientific research to policy news related to long COVID, as well as arts and culture stories. We are really focused on, acknowledging the ongoing pandemic as ongoing COVID as a disease that is continuing to spread and have major impacts on people's lives, and really try not to minimize or deny anybody's experiences in that end. And we are supported largely by our readers with donations, gifts, grants, and some sponsorships lately. And today we're also joined by a couple of great guest speakers, Madeline Miller, Torie Bosch from STAT, and Funmi Okunola from Long COVID The Answers. So thank you all for being here. We're going to introduce them in more detail later, but just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you to them for their time. Now I'm going to turn it over to Miles, who's going to talk a little bit more about like why we wanted to hold this event and why we think op-eds are such an important vehicle for sharing about long COVID.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miles Griffis. I am one of the co-founders of the Sick Times and our executive editor. Um, I, yeah, just a little backstory on this event. We receive a lot of pitches from the community, and they're, usually about op-eds and commentary. We also receive a lot of reported pitches. We're such a small outlet. We're, right now we're three people. We'll be hiring a fourth soon who will be on our team that we're excited to announce. Um, but we're a small team, so we unfortunately can't tell every long COVID story. So a lot of advice we give when we have to turn down a pitch is to pitch it elsewhere, especially local publications and other national publications or different public interest publications that might have a good like a spin for long COVID, or you might be able to um, get it into a different outlet. So we wanted to put together a resource that could help people do that. The process of pitching is something we, as Betsy and I, worked as freelance reporters for a long time, so it's something we're really familiar with. Um, but it's not the most accessible to the greater public. So we put together we I wanted to give tips to the community on how to best pitch, how to find out, who accepts pitches and demystify the process of writing an op-ed as it's kind of different in every publication. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But overall, the long COVID op-ed has been a really big uh, tool, I would say, for raising awareness about long COVID, um, demanding different things from research to support. It has been a really big, yeah, I guess tool is sort of a good way to say it, but a way to raise awareness about long COVID. Some of the first op-eds about long COVID came through op-eds. Early on, people who started to share their experiences documented it. We have this one from Fee Lowenstein from April 13th, 2020. So about a month after, I think a lot of people, especially first waivers, will remember this one. Um, but this sort of helped other people understand that, oh, I haven't recovered from my SARS-CoV-2 infection. So it's one way to sort of alert the community, I think, on different things that are happening that reporting might not catch up as quickly on. So a lot of op-eds, I think, sometimes can get to news before reported stories, so they can really kind of set a tone about what reporters should be looking at. And long COVID was obviously one of those things. Um, Betsy, next slide, please. Here we have, or back one, Betsy. So here we have Madeline Miller's op-ed. This was also a very, very important op-ed that I think a lot of people in the community remember. Um, this told a really personal story, and really just sort of let a lot of people know that long COVID was not over, that the pandemic isn't over. It was a very, very bold and brave op-ed from an incredible author that I think people really stopped people in their tracks and let them kind of assess that, wait a minute, what's actually going, what is long COVID? I think a lot of people still at this point in 2023 had not heard of it. And this was a very important moment within op-eds. Um, yes, so beyond sort of telling, so those first two are sort of more examples of, I think, you know, it- alerting the world to what a lot of people with long COVID are experiencing. And now we have in this October 2023, um, the use that op-eds can be used to make sort of demands and propose solutions to problems, which is one really useful way to approach an op-ed is kind of attaching a call to action is kind of what we use in journalism sometimes as editors. So this one was published in Nature, and it was calling for $1 billion every year for 10 years for research. This ended up leading to a bill by Bernie Sanders, the long COVID moonshot bill, that was not successful originally. It's still kind of, I think I don't know what its official status is, but sort of in limbo right now. But was some of the biggest momentum, I think, came from starting sort of this op-ed and this idea. And then, yeah, then other op-eds. This one, Ed Young, he is one of our advisors at the Sick Times. I think this was also a very important op-ed because it came from someone who spent a lot of time reporting on and speaking with people with long COVID. Ed is obviously super well known um, in journalism and book writing, nonfiction book writing. So I think this was also sort of a way to teach other journalists how to report as well, and brought a lot of attention to the disease and how to better cover it, which I think is one of the reasons why Betsy and I started the Sick Times about a month before this. So we were thinking, I remember when this came out about a month after, and it really confirmed, I think, a lot of why we started the Sick Times, because we weren't seeing the disease covered as um, as unblinkingly as it should have been. This was in Stat. This was also a very big op-ed that came out. I remember a lot of people talking about it. Again, it was, showing this personal experience. I think kind of a theme within a lot of mainstream press was that long COVID was going away. But as we see over the years, as I was looking at more op-eds for this, people continue to share their experience. People continue to get long COVID at different times. Throughout the pandemic. So it's not just uh, you know, just first waivers have long COVID. People continue to develop it um, and experience it very extremely. Again, yeah, this is another great sort of research op-ed that is calling for a very specific action, which is clinical trials. So this is by Amy Prohl of Polybio, and it was calling for more clinical trials into long COVID. And that led to, I mean, this led to sort of this trend we're seeing where we are seeing a lot more clinical trials in long COVID. These weren't happening until around 2023 is sort of when they first started, a lot of the bigger ones. Um, and it just sort of shows, this need that patients have been asking for, research have been asking for, and that's more research funding for long COVID. Um, this is sort of another solution-based op-ed. And then we've also seen op-eds that really minimize long COVID. The op-ed can be used um, to minimize, to, argue that maybe it's not as big of a problem as we thought. Um, so I think the power of the op-ed, and we'll talk more about, the perspective, but it's written by, someone with a point of view. So every op-ed has a point of view. They can be super, super, you might agree with them and you might not. So I think, this by Marty McCary, who's now the director of the FDA, was sort of saying that, he's been a notorious long COVID minimizer, and this was a very prominent example in the Wall Street Journal. Um, so yeah, the power of the op-ed can be used in a lot of different ways. So yeah, what is an op-ed? We'll break it down a little bit here. It was fun doing research on this because didn't really know a lot of these sort of specific facts, but op-ed, generally the term most agreed upon is it's opposite of the editorial page. So this was around it kind of the history seems like it's kind of argued a little bit, but the op-eds originally kind of started to develop in the 1920s. It was sort of a format to encompass a lot of different opinions, reviews, obituaries. And then through the 1970s, it kind of evolved into different forms of commentary. So there's lots of different kind of starting points. And the more modern op-ed we see now, it has some roots in New York Times, Washington Post. There's a lot of different um, sort of ideas of exactly where it came from, but at the base, unlike reporting, which does not show generally like the writer's perspective on the topic, op-eds can tell a really strong point of view from the writer. So they can be used to advocate for change. They can be used to identify a problem, introduce solutions. Um, Op-eds have a typical structure, but they all kind of vary on each publication. So usually they're built around a thesis or like a main argument or idea. So if we're looking at one of those examples from earlier, like the moonshot uh, in Nature by Lisa McCorkle and Michael Peluso was stating, we can solve long COVID, but we need at least $1 billion a year. And they sort of put together that based off of different calculations. They made arguments of why $1 billion was needed, um, why other diseases have received, similar funding that have led to change. So they're usually between 700 and 1,200 words. They can run shorter, they can run longer. But generally, they're a shorter, more concise argument. They usually come with about four parts. You might not recognize them. They might not be like broken up into these different subheads, but some do. And they usually end with sort of like a call to action, which can be pretty broad. It could be, we all need to support this new long COVID bill, or, um, you know, we're developed like many of us, like the early ones in the pandemic, saying, we're all developing long COVID. We need to do something about it. It can sort of just be a siren sometimes of alert. Yeah, so op-eds offer a timely and unique perspective on a topic, and trying to sort of persuade the reader and to understand um, their perspective. So to do that, you need to sort of build your argument. So whenever we work with writers, I always try to ask them to kind of think of what their headline would be. Like, what is the one message that's short that you want people to know? And usually that's your thesis, but not always. But it's a helpful way to think of what you're about to write. Um, yeah, so I guess, yeah, to summarize, like the op-ed is a very powerful tool. It's been very important in the long COVID, within the long COVID space over the past 6 years. And it can be used by anyone. I think a lot of like the larger papers, you'll see politicians, researchers, people with some level of fame. But op-eds can be written by anyone, so don't be intimidated by that. Um, as long as you sort of are the right person to write it and you make that argument, you can write an op-ed.
Okay, so I'm going to now talk a little bit about the process of pitching or submitting an op-ed. So one thing we wanted to kind of emphasize at the top here is that different publications have different guidelines and expectations for these pieces. One pretty notable distinction is that some places want a full draft. So Stat, for example, takes like submissions of pieces, whereas the Sick Times would prefer a pitch, which is more of a short description of the article that you want to write, which is usually pretty brief, a couple of paragraphs or a couple hundred words. And so looking at the publication's guidelines of the place you're interested in pitching to and making sure that you meet those guidelines or reaching out to editors if you have questions about them, I think will kind of take you a long way. It's also always helpful to have like a clear email subject line, put pitch in it, put submission in it, put some sort of pithy description of your topic or your argument. Just because editors who are receiving these often get a lot of emails. I know we do at the Sick Times, and we're a small publication, so I can only imagine what someone like Torie's inbox looks like. So trying to kind of be really clear and making sure that your email stands out can be helpful. So then kind of within the email, you might want to, write out what your thesis might be, what your main argument might be, what your call to action for the reader might be. Put some support for the argument. For example, like would you be citing research papers? Would you be citing experiences that you have had or that you know about from community members and loved ones? Would you be citing like other kinds of evidence. So kind of laying that out is really helpful, including some sense of why the story might be timely. So one reason why we're having this webinar now is because we know Long COVID Awareness Month and Day is coming up next month. And so that might be an opportunity, particularly if you were thinking about pitching or submitting something to a local news publication, kind of saying, hey, it's the anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring COVID to be a pandemic, and it's Long COVID Awareness Month, it's Long COVID Awareness Day. That might help to get an editor's attention a little bit more if Long COVID isn't something that they're regularly thinking about. So that can be kind of a helpful thing to emphasize. Or at other times of year, there might be other kinds of timely factors or ways that you could call attention to this topic. It's also always really helpful if you are sending a pitch rather than a full submission to share past examples of your writing. So we're pretty flexible with this at the Sick Times. We'll take anything from like a past news publication that you've written or a past news article that you've written or past essay to like a blog post or social media posts. Or a few times people have sent us like testimony that they've submitted when supporting a bill, and so like an advocacy kind of context. All of that kind of works for us to help show what your writing style is like. Um, or I'm sure there are other kinds of examples that I haven't thought of. And then also including something about why you're the right person to write this particular piece is always helpful. So this is just like a little bit more specifics about what we look for in pitches specifically at the Sick Times. So we would love to see a summary of the piece's goal, why it's relevant to our audience, why you're the right person to write it. Kind of an important distinction between us and other outlets is that we are for you, the long COVID community. So we're really looking for arguments and messages that are going to resonate with that community specifically. So we're not necessarily looking for op-eds where the argument is like long COVID is real, believe people with long COVID, because we know that our readers are coming to our publication with that kind of baseline knowledge and expectation. So we really want to be sharing like new arguments, new ideas, new advocacy opportunities, things of that nature. So Miles kind of put a couple questions in this slide that might help you think about potential ideas. And we also ask people to send their pitches to editors@thesicktimes.org, which is an email address that goes to everyone on our team rather than one of us, just because since we get a lot of emails, it's kind of helpful to keep track um, when pitches go to everybody. I also wanted to share an example of a successful pitch for an op-ed to us. So this was a pitch sent by a writer named Miranda, who actually is here in this webinar. She graciously allowed us to share this with you all. So it's on 2 slides just because we didn't want it to be like really tiny text. So this was a pitch that became an article about the administrative burden that particularly people with more severe long COVID and myalgic encephalomyelitis face in trying to get support with different sort of day-to-day needs. Things like, as she kind of, you can see her talk about in this pitch, IV therapy or transportation to medical appointments. And so a few things that were kind of successful about this pitch. One is that she was presenting a specific argument. You can see it sort of, it was bold in her original email, which can be kind of a nice thing to do, really making your argument stick out, making sure the editor sees that specifically. The pitch also was responding to a prior article that we had done. In this case, it was a big journalistic feature that we had published, I think, a couple of weeks or fairly recently before this pitch was sent. So for us, reading the pitch just sort of signified like, oh, this is someone who's been following our publication, has a good idea of what we cover, kind of knows how this proposed story would fit into our larger body of work. And then also this pitch, included pieces of specific evidence. She was talking about examples that she would cite, ways that she would bring in other people's experiences in addition to her own experience. And it talks about why she would be a good person to write this piece, mentioning both her own personal experience and advocacy that she has done, that was sort of relevant to this subject. Um, and there are links to a couple of writing and advocacy examples. So I think like I'm focused on sharing the slides, so I'm not able to pull up the link and put it in the chat, but hopefully Miles and Heather will do that before we go on to the next slide so that you can read the published piece if you haven't already. We also wanted to just give a shout out to the Open Notebook, which is a science writing resource site that has tons and tons of valuable information, including on pitching and including on essays and op-eds on science topics. So one great resource that they have is a pitch database where you can look up examples of successful pitches, like the one I just showed you from Miranda, and then see the resulting story. So there's a handful of essay and op-ed ones in this database, as well as many science news pitches and feature pitches. They also have an online course about pitching science stories that is free to take and is delivered asynchronously, plus a ton of other stuff. Um, and then finally, there are other ways to get your voice out there without writing a full article or going through kind of the full pitching process. So a couple of those are writing letters to the editor. I think Ezra mentioned in the chat that he has done this. So this can be basically responding to an existing article. We've printed a couple of these at the Sick Times, people pointing out things that we missed in our coverage or responding in some way. So usually these are not pitched, you just write your letter and you submit it. Um, and then also people can, share comments on social media, send emails to journalists or to editors, let them know about things they missed. We are always happy to consider tips from people or like story ideas, recommendations for sources like scientists or healthcare workers or advocates whom we should be talking to. Really any kind of ideas. Sometimes we can't look into something right away, but we always kind of keep track of the ideas that people are sending us and try to incorporate them into future stories. And so now I will kick it back to Miles and we will start talking to our guest speakers.
All right, so first up, we're going to do sort of all three interviews, and then we're going to start asking our excellent guests some questions. First up is Torie Bosch, the first opinion editor at Stat. She was previously the editor of Future Tense, a collaboration between Slate Magazine, Arizona State University, and the New America that covers the intersection of technology, policy, and society. She also founded State of Mind, a Slate ASU partnership dedicated to mental health, and was a lecturer and editor in residence at ASU's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications. She is the editor of You Are Not Expected to Understand This: How 26 Lines of Code Changed the World. She is a graduate of Penn State University and lives outside of Philadelphia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
We're so glad you're joining us. Next is Madeline Miller. She's a best-selling novelist. She attended Brown University, where she earned her BA and MA in classics. She has taught and tutored in Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students for over 15 years. The Song of Achilles, her first novel, was awarded the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction and was a New York Times bestseller. Her second novel, Circe, was a instant number one on the New York Times bestseller list and won numerous awards. It is currently being adapted for a series with HBO. Um, Sorry, there's so many hearts blowing up that it covered the letters. Um, with HBO Max, Miller's novels have been translated into over 25 languages, and her essays have appeared in a number of publications, including The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and NPR.org. In 2023, she shared her experience with long COVID with the Washington Post in an article, Long COVID Has Derailed My Life, Make No Mistake. She currently lives outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And lastly, we have Dr. Funmi Okunola, a Canada-based family physician and founder of Kojala Medical, the company behind Long COVID, The Answers, a trusted, evidence-based information website hub with a formerly CME accredited podcast series ranked in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide by Listen Notes. She leads a team dedicated to raising awareness, advancing education, research, and improving treatment for long COVID through accessible online communication. She's committed to supporting the medical community in recognizing and managing long COVID and other complex chronic diseases so patients receive timely, equitable care. She also wrote a excellent op-ed for us last, I guess it was the summer of 2024. We are so glad to have you all here. First question is, when you receive, your inbox is very full, you receive a lot of pitches. What kind of makes a pitch stand out to you? What do you sort of look for in a submission?
Um, it's such a hard question, especially because you and Betsy discussed op-eds and what's important so clearly. So I don't want to repeat you too much, but to me, it really is something that makes me say, I never thought of it that way before. So something that makes me sort of excited. I get really excited about new ideas. What's something that animates me? And probably more importantly, will animate our audience. So while the Sick Times is aimed at the long COVID community, Stat is somewhere between maybe the Sick Times and its sort of specific audience and the New York Times and its general interest audience. Our readership is made up primarily of people who have some really compelling reason to care deeply about healthcare and medicine. So, what is something that's going to excite both a physician and perhaps someone who works in biotech? And that's what really gets me excited to work on a piece.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's like a good line to remember when pitching. I guess, yeah, my first sort of question is, long COVID is life altering, life shattering. How do you sort of convey that experience in such a short piece? Whether it's, in an op-ed, you did such an excellent job of that. How do you sort of put all of that grief and nuance into a short and accessible piece to resonate with folks.
Thank you so much for that. It's actually quite challenging, and it's quite challenging for many reasons. First of all, because it's ongoing, right? All of this is ongoing. My symptoms are ongoing. COVID is ongoing, right? All this is still happening, and I'm not one of those writers and that can sort of write from a place of like letting it bleed. I often like to have processed something and really thought about it and worked it through before I write about it, particularly in a memoir situation. But I couldn't do that. I had to write from the middle of it. So I gave myself a ton of time, and I highly recommend that. Give yourself way more time, because the last thing you need is stressing yourself out with, feeling like you have this deadline and you've put all this pressure on yourself. It probably took me 3 months to write that. Partially that's because I write very slowly now, but it's also because I had so much to say. And I had so much that I was working through as I was writing it, and then I would get all wound up and angry, and then I'd have to like rest, and then I'd have to come back to it and do it again, and then I would feel grief, and then I'd feel, I really wanted to fit so much in there, and I couldn't. And I think we're all keenly aware of all the ways that long COVID and other sort of post-viral illnesses, chronic illness, are incredibly intersectional. I wanted to fit every intersection in there. And I couldn't get them all in, but I really wanted, there were some that were non-negotiable for me. It was non-negotiable for me to mention ME. That was really, really important, and I wanted that to be in there. And so sort of making that list of things that I knew was non-negotiable, and then what else could I cram in, and then accepting that it couldn't be the be all and end all. I was just going to have to write a couple of these, and that was okay too. Yeah, I think the final thing I would say with sort of that process of being in the middle of the grief, aside from pacing and giving yourself lots of time, is also, I think sometimes some op-eds really look for that, like kind of almost like titillating horror in sort of what people have been through. And I would just encourage you to like draw a fence around some of that for yourself. Like, you don't have to disclose anything you don't want to disclose, and don't feel like you have to in order to make this happen. Like, do be protective of yourself as you're writing it. I touched on very briefly in that piece a couple people who I lost who are incredibly dear to me, and I kind of wanted to go into more, and I was like, you know what, I'm doing too much. I need to just make this really quick, because they're like a book. I can't fit them in here, and I'd rather just not even say them at all than give them that quick. So just giving yourself the time to work through all those feelings of anger and exhaustion and grief, and so that you can come to peace with what you have to say.
Very well said. Yeah, I think that's something we, like, as an editor, I will try to remind folks to, like, just sort of remind, like, giving them permission that they don't have to include everything, that they can protect, parts of their story, and that there's always opportunities for more writing and to think about it later on. But I love that idea of like, here are my top 5 things I need to say. I think that's a really smart way to build around what you want to put in, especially in something so complex like long COVID. Um, for Dr. Okunola, we have, I guess, um, when you wrote for us, you wrote, it's sort of about why you launched Long COVID, the answers. Um, I guess, yeah, what would you like other potential writers to know about sort of the editorial process that you experience with us or in other op-eds in communication? What does it sort of look like behind the scenes?
Yeah, it was quite a challenge writing that op-ed because I thought that I'd structured really well what I had to say, but obviously you're the experts in terms of journalism, and just going backwards and forwards with you and refining and refining and refining, that was a real learning experience. So, and I think.
for different reasons, Madeline talked about giving yourself time and not putting pressure on yourself, which I think is very important if you're suffering from a chronic, relapsing, and remitting illness. Not to make yourself sick, but in terms of somebody who's well and able-bodied, but extremely busy with lots of priorities. We all have life, we have work. We have our dreams and objectives, is again giving yourself time to write something like that, particularly if you're not a professional journalist. Giving yourself time and space. But it was a great learning experience for me. Betsy and Miles guided me into, writing a piece that was well structured, and had an evidence base. And so I could deliver something that people could relate to, that still retained my passion, of what I wanted to say, but was clear and direct. And the biggest thing I learned was that, I needed to be open to learn and to hear and accept, criticism or probing. But also I needed time so that I didn't get overly stressed about having to do it. So yeah, so with that direct experience, that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad it was rewarding. I mean, it was rewarding for us too. I think it always is to work with different writers and learn like what people want to share and all of that. I know another question we had for you, Funmi, which kind of came up in the registration form, like that people were submitting as they were RSVPing for the webinar, was, advocating and communicating about long COVID, specifically to other healthcare workers, which obviously your platform that's kind of the key audience, one of the key audiences. So I wanted to ask how you approach doing that and sort of thinking about, people who might be dismissive of COVID-19, people who maybe had traumatic experiences like in 2020 when we were in a really intense period in healthcare, how you kind of approach bringing up this topic and educating people.
Well, as all, I guess most people here, on this kind of webinar interview thing today is a long COVID advocate. I feel very passionate about raising an awareness, understanding, education about long COVID. Um, but the majority, unfortunately, of the world's population are not. And so I think one of the greatest things that you can do is to actually listen, because I feel very passionate and I get really angry when people dismiss long COVID. Um, but that doesn't get you very far. Most people are good on this planet, and they very often don't have, vindictive or nasty reasons for not not understanding about long COVID, or not wanting to advocate, or seemingly not want to hear. They very often have valid reasons. So I think, it's really important to listen. Because I remember a colleague of mine, who was a family physician. We were at dinner and she says, "Oh, long COVID, it's all in their heads, isn't it?" And like the steam was coming out of my ears. And I thought, and I was in a public place, and I think that helps, for me not to shout. And so I just thought, no, you know what? I'm going to listen. And because I know she's a really good doctor, why would she have this opinion? And, actually, what was revealed was that she was traumatized. She had lost, I think it was about 4 or 5 family members at the height of the pandemic, people that were really, really close to her. And basically, she just didn't want to hear about anything that had COVID in the sentence. I also, in the course of the conversation, diagnosed her with long COVID. So she was somebody who was suffering in denial. So she had all of these issues that had turned her away, and she was a healthcare professional. who was just as educated as me. So, yeah, so now, and that changed my whole approach to, well, that was one of many things that changed my approach to advocacy. It's really important to listen and really important to use that information to reflect back to that person as to why their expression or perspective might be erroneous. And we spent I think it was an hour and a half, 2 hours talking about this subject. And I think I managed to convince her that long COVID is a pathophysiological process with a scientific basis. And yeah, and it also helped me to realize why so many of my colleagues are rejecting long COVID when we should be leading the way. We're healthcare professionals. We're at the forefront of delivering. Why is the medical profession turning its face against something that is the elephant in the room in clear and plain sight? And part of it is because we're human beings too. We've been traumatized, we've lost loved ones. And unfortunately, and also we're a profession that likes to solve things. And a lot of people and the people leading our education and medicine are people that we don't have a biomarker. We don't. It's supposed to be. It's long COVID is deemed to be incurable, and so the medical profession tends to turn its back in that situation. Cancer was in this. If you speak to your grandparents, cancer was a disease that nobody ever talked about. People died from it. There was stigma attached to it. It was the big C. Have a conversation with some of your grandparents and great grandparents who would remember that. And I think probably that turned when medicine found biomarkers of certain forms of cancer and cures. And now it's a big, sexy disease. And unfortunately, with long COVID, we're at that stage that cancer was at, 30 to 60 years ago. We're not People like myself and Miles and Betsy and Torie and everyone else here are not going to allow it to be 30 to 60 years, Madeline, for long COVID to turn the corner in the way that it took cancer. We're determined to, you know, get a change of heart, way before that. But you know, yeah, that was a great. I've rambled on a bit, but I hope I've kind of conveyed what you asked. I think listening is
Oh
really,
yeah.
really important.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think those are really important points. Tori, I wanted to ask you another one. In terms of like working with writers, what is the editorial process like at Stat for op-eds there, and how do you kind of help people hone their argument? Or like Madeline was talking about, when it's a super complex topic and there's a lot to say, how do you help folks think about kind of packing that into a short space?
Yeah, so I'm going to share our submission guidelines just so people have them. If you Google First Opinion, you can also find the guidelines. So you can refer back there on anything I say here if that's helpful. As Betsy mentioned, I do generally ask on my guidelines for a completed piece to be submitted to me at first set opinion at statnews.com. So a couple colleagues can also see it. Um, but I'm not super rigid on that. So if you would feel better about sending a couple of paragraphs sketching out your argument, that's completely fine too. I'm flexible on the submission versus pitch thing in these sorts of cases. Though with a personal essay, especially, it is generally helpful to see the full piece. I get a lot of submissions. In a really busy week, I get 100 submissions and publish maybe 12 pieces. And so the most important thing to say is that I have to turn down a lot of wonderful pieces. I could probably, swap out 50% of what I publish for things that I have to turn down, and it would be a very high quality publication still. There's lots of great pieces that I just pass on for bandwidth reasons. For topic mix, we cover a huge range of topics. So, trying to mix things up is important to me. So that's the first thing. If I turn down a submission, please do submit again. Lots of people I end up publishing on their third or fourth submission or fifth even. And yeah, know that it's difficult timing wise often too. Um, So if I accept the submission, the process is going to change a little bit based on timing. I do run a lot of pieces that are based on the news, but I'm also and on those pieces we often need to move very quickly. As Madeline mentioned, that might not be ideal for you given your energy levels wherever you might be at that time. So if you're pitching a news story, please do let me know kind of your availability for edits. We'll be able to look at it, that afternoon or the next morning and get back to me quickly. Sort of keep that part in mind as we're going. Generally, once I have a submitted piece, I do try to edit very quickly if it's time sensitive. If it's not time sensitive, it might be several weeks or even a month or two before I can get to it. Feel free to check in. Once I am editing it, we usually go back and forth 2, 3, 4 times. I'll ask questions. I'll, suggest restructuring. As Dr. Okunola referred to earlier, with her experience with the sick times, I might ask for the language to be more conversational, links to more sources, that sort of thing. I want to land on a version of the piece that feels authentic to you and your voice. So I really try not to do extensive rewriting, which happens sometimes at op-ed pages at major publications. But so yeah, we'll land on a version that sounds like you and that I think is a fit for our audience. And then the last thing I'll mention there for the editorial process is that I do always show headlines to the author. And this really varies depending on publication. Lots of op-ed pages do not let the author see a headline before publication. I've never understood that convention particularly. I don't understand why it should be a surprise to the writer. So I will write a headline that I think will work for us for SEO reasons, for Google News reasons, for social media reasons, for people clicking reasons. A lot of thinking does go into this stuff, but I will be very open to your feedback. And I am not going to publish something that you wouldn't be proud to share on social media. So that's the general process.
Thank you. Yeah, we try to do that at the Sick Times too, in terms of making sure the writer has seen what we're thinking for the headline and can offer feedback or anything like that. Um, Madeline, another question that came up in people's registration forms was kind of how to balance the different potential audiences for these kinds of pieces, like the one you wrote, because obviously you are trying to educate the broader public about long COVID, trying to share like, hey, the pandemic isn't over, that kind of thing, but also wanting to say something that maybe resonates with the others in the long COVID community. So I'm curious how you kind of thought about that for your piece, or if you have any recommendations.
Absolutely. And I'm going to pick up on something I saw someone say also as well in the chat, which is that the first thing I did was I wrote my angriest version because I was angry and I felt like I had to get that out. And so I did, I mean, pages and pages and pages of drafts, 50 drafts at least. And that's my normal novel writing process anyway. So that's very new to me. I mean, sorry, that's not new to me. But I don't write a lot of op-eds. And so it was interesting to see like, oh, I'm just doing my regular old novel process here. But the angry version was quite helpful because I could really feel where that heat was. And for me, I always want to go where that heat is and sort of reach for like those things that are really important and passionate. And that helped me shape. And then I could rewrite it in a way that was, that could speak to people where my voice was controlled and, but I had gotten all that gush out. I had a couple different audiences in mind. Obviously, I was trying to kind of speak to a larger audience, but my, long COVID audience was also on my mind. I had been frustrated by some of the writing I had seen about it, and I felt like I wanted to sort of write in solidarity with other people who were going through what I was going through. So that was in my mind as a piece of my audience. A very important reader was someone who's been a longtime reader of my novels, kind of first reader for me on my novels, but who actually very similar is not COVID conscious, sees it as all over, definitely has long COVID. I mean, that's a very typical, it's not, I think that comes up. But he obviously has been sort of he's a close friend. He's been close to my writing before, but he's not in this community and he doesn't know a lot of the language. And so every time he would say, wait, what's that? I don't understand PEM. I don't understand. So that was very helpful to be bouncing off of someone who could sort of just give me feedback on like, I'm not following this. I don't take this as a given. So if you can find sort of a helpful friend who's outside the community, who's willing to read that for you and sort of give you that like, I'm well disposed towards you, but I'm not following what you're saying, for those moments to kind of give you that perspective, that was very helpful. And then, of course, I did have in my mind, like, that there were going to be people who were set against this. And I don't think you can write to armor yourself against trolls, and I don't think you should. Because the trolls are going to find their way in, and we can talk about like the comment section. I recommend having a good friend be your filter, your HEPA filter, and if you want, they can read them and just tell you the nice ones. I would not recommend going there, but I think I did have a mind to not giving ammunition to the sort of classic tropes circling around long COVID at the time. So I was very mindful to avoid any of that ammunition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think we're gonna ask more of the questions that folks have posed in the chat, but first, we wanted to ask the speakers if there's anything else you wanted to make sure you had a chance to say, because we have a lot of questions.
If I may, in terms of submissions that I look for, I think in the ideal world, any stat op-ed should be something that someone will disagree with. And ideally, I mean, I would love to publish op-eds about places of disagreement within the long COVID community, for instance. Thinking about someone can respectfully disagree with you in good faith is a great way to start with pieces for me. So yeah, think about how something could actually kickstart conversation. I often say, think about writing the verse rather than the chorus. So it really should stick out and get people talking.
Funmi, did you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I think hold on, I just lower my hand. I think it's really one of the main things I'm pushing for now in within the long COVID community is to really have an understanding of the post-COVID syndrome. And I'm going to quickly explain this. There's basically really four ways now we need to understand the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's four groups of people that are affected. There's people that are still hospitalized with a COVID-19 infection, and they tend to be the over 75s, the unvaccinated, and those that are immunocompromised, and those with complex chronic disease, chronic diseases such as diabetes and ischemic heart disease. That whole group of people is hospitalized. They end up in ICU or high care, and they come out with long COVID and basically organ failure from sepsis. The second group are the long haulers here, people that had so-called mild or moderate disease, or maybe even an asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infection, and then end up with long COVID. The third group of people are those that with pre-existing complex chronic disease, such as fibromyalgia, ME/CFS. They get infected with SARS-CoV-2 and it worsens their pre-existing illness. And the fourth group are the rest of us who consider ourselves to be able-bodied and healthy, who are repeatedly infected with SARS-CoV-2, and we're seeing huge rates, increased rates of type 2 diabetes, heart attacks, every type of heart disease, reactivation of viruses. So we're seeing young people now in primary care presenting with shingles, what we term the old man's disease. There's a reason why you get your shingles vaccine at 50 rather than 23, where I'm seeing people under the age of 45 in practice now presenting with shingles, likely because of SARS-CoV-2. And Zaid Ali and Jan Juar in BC have done research that has shown increases in these diseases in the general population. You need to make you need everybody's we have a selfish gene. It's what about me? People are not really interested in hearing about the 10 to 15% of the population, you guys, which probably have a genetic predisposition to developing long COVID. Oh, yeah, I feel really sorry for you, but that's your issue. We need to make it their issue. We need to help them to recognize that they probably have someone in their friend group or in their family or loved one that is suffering from long COVID, but also that they themselves are being affected by repeated infections of a virus that is entering every organ of their body and creating a chronic inflammatory syndrome, which might be responsible for the heart attack they have. If they're in their 50s in 2 weeks' time, or their pulmonary embolism that suddenly happened at the age of 25, or their type 2 diabetes with no family history of it. That was probably from the SARS-CoV-2 infection that you had when you were masked and went to that concert in a closed room 3 or 4 weeks ago. We need to make it about them, and our advocacy needs to turn towards that. And also, people suffering from long COVID need a team of people to get them better. It's, if you're diagnosed early enough, 60% of you will go into remission, and 40% of you will have a better quality of life. So yeah, it's important that healthcare professionals recognize that. But you need a team if you're sick and undiagnosed to get you better or have a better quality of life. A team of occupational therapists, physiotherapists, etc., and so forth. Well, guess what? 20% of the average primary care practice of patients needs that too. My, young 11-year-old who's been diagnosed with acute leukemia needs a team of people to get them better. And a social worker for their family to access disability benefits, an occupational health therapist to get them rehabilitated, and a physiotherapist, just like you guys. And if those services were there for you, they're there for everybody. So that needs to be the message now. I'd like long COVID advocates to broaden their mind and to help others broaden their mind to recognize this isn't just about you guys who are suffering out there. It's about the rest of you who are at risk and the rest of you that need allied health to get you better. I think that's where we need to go.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think like there are so many potential story ideas in what you just said too about like the potential what are the potential areas of needed education for all of these different parts of medicine, for all of these different healthcare services. How could any and all of these places better be serving not just, as you were saying, people with long COVID, but people who have seen changes to their health after repeated SARS-CoV-2 infections that they might not necessarily recognize or label as long COVID. Um, yeah, Madeline, is there anything else you would want to add just before we take some more audience questions?
I mean, I think everything you just said is so brilliant, and everything everyone has said. I'm just thinking so much about what the next pieces I'd like to write. So thank you for for being inspiring. I think that one of I guess the only thing I'll say is that I think what is so exciting about this event is the fact that we all have our own area that we can speak to and that we can write to, whether it's personal experience, whether it's from the humanities side, or it's from the or from a more scientific background, or whatever your background is, or whatever your experience has been. I think we need everyone's voice because we all need to be pushing at the same time. And I think if we all are pushing at the same time, then hopefully we can move things further along and we can speak to all those different groups of people who are, I feel like there's just so, now there's this group of us and group of people who care about this issue. And so I'm grateful for all of you here, for everyone who's working on this, and let's just all keep pushing.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, there was one question that was for Torie, but I think Miles maybe also could speak to this, which is, as a journalist who has long COVID and covers long COVID, I found it hard to fathom pitching personal essays on long COVID to outlets other than the Sick Times because of sensing that disability justice is too radical for mainstream media. So I guess the kind of question is like, how do you think about what types of pieces on this subject might be a good fit for stat or for other kinds of maybe more general interest type outlets, as opposed to for us at the Sick Times.
So I think the first thing is it doesn't have to be a personal essay. I typically like to run pieces that are sort of a combination of personal experience with something bigger. So this gets to the idea that we've sort of touched on previously in this conversation of, you don't have to mine, the worst things you've suffered to weigh in on something here. You know, thinking sometimes, in fact, for stat, thinking kind of about the bigger picture implications of what you're writing about, the policy, what it means for research for us is actually really important. I think, thinking about how much you trust your editor is really important. So feeling, comfortable asking questions and pushing back, especially if you're talking about something personal, is also worth keeping in mind, is a little bit of a side note. Um, yeah, I mean, to be frank, I probably would not run a piece that has disability justice in the headline because I think even the our readership might find that idea as being maybe sort of too conceptual or too something. I don't know what it is. It might vary by people, but it just won't draw in our readers. I think sometimes it's worth thinking in how you sneak in the idea without calling it that. We try to avoid jargon, medical jargon, and we also, try to avoid some advocacy jargon. So that's another way of thinking about it. When you talk about disability justice, what does that actually mean? And once we get to the sort of concrete idea, it sort of doesn't matter whether you use that phrase or not. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Another question we got was about sort of raising interest or piquing the interest of a publication about an activism project, or I think the same could maybe also apply to like a particular research project or any kind of or maybe an organization or like a local advocacy effort that someone might want to share news about to a broader audience. So the question is it often better to pitch a story about what you've learned from the project, like you writing about your own project, or, submit something for consideration as a news piece, or how would you what are different ways that somebody might think about that? I think at the Sick Times we've kind of done it both ways. Um,
Yeah, I would. It's so hard to give an answer. It really depends on how compelling the writing is on either approach. I mean, it's difficult to sort of say in the hypothetical. I will say that I have a pretty high bar for this is my project pieces. You've got this is my project can be something you mention maybe to support a bigger argument you're making. So, here's a big problem. Here's one way, my colleagues and I are thinking about it. And here are two other projects that are doing sort of interesting things in the same space. So that's another point of where, thinking about really what the argument you're making is rather than the topic of the piece.
yeah, that makes sense. Um, Let's see. I wanted to say also that folks are welcome to put more questions in the chat. I think we've got through a couple, but we have time for maybe one or two more. I wanted to ask something else of Funmi in the meantime. One question that we often get at the Sick Times and also got in the registrations for this webinar was about advocating in like local spaces, say to a medical center that's in somebody's city or state, or asking for like better infection prevention measures, or I think another example that we got was somebody wanting better COVID precautions at like a Pride event that's being planned for the summer. What are some ways that you might recommend people kind of think about that? Maybe building on some of the ideas you were talking about before of like we're all impacted by this.
Um, I would say definitely research the place that you're advocating for higher protections. So to give you an example, I work in a healthcare setting and I'm very often the only person masked most of the time. And then I approached one of the clinical directors who was like-minded, like myself. And I said, how can I persuade the nurses to mask? And the answer was, you'll be stepping on, basically it's there's all sorts of union rules. Masking is very political, and I wouldn't go there. So I just led by example. So I actually handed out a few masks, and then I discovered that they have to wear the blue surgical masks and not KN95s or N95s, and there's various political reasons for that. So I just wear my mask, and I make it match my clothing, and it becomes a fun thing. So you have to be aware of the environment. So if you're going to go and ask for better protections in a healthcare center or in a concert, and say you want better air filtration, but the concert venue is quite impoverished and couldn't afford that, then you need to be aware of that and think of how you can bring in something that would be affordable but still fun. So I wear my mask, and the nurses just come up to me and say, "Oh my God, it matches your clothes. Where'd you get that?" And I shared the website, and that's really encouraged them. And then we had an outbreak, and they were told to mask. And so I had a conversation yesterday about masks in the staff room, and about why they're important and why it's important that you don't wear them down here and stuff like that. And the effectiveness of their mask versus mine. And so now they're aware of that. And so now they can go back to their union and say, actually, I don't want to wear surgical masks. I want a KN95. Dr. Okunola is wearing it. Why can't I? And so, you have to be aware of the environment that you're in, do that research and tailor. You're not going to get, I mean, okay, the nurses are not going to be able to, some of them might be able to afford the KN95s. But I said to them, look, masking, even if it's less protective than what I'm wearing, is better than no mask at all. You're protecting your patients, and you're protecting yourselves and your family. And so, that's made them aware. So, it's better, obviously I'd love them to all come in with KN95s or N95s, but at least they're now masking, and at least they now understand why it's important. So, sometimes a small win is better than no win, and it builds on getting the bigger win. And in terms of, so say you're going to a fairly wealthy company and you want them to adopt air filtration and ventilation things, then you say things like, well, how about the University of Colorado? I had a conversation recently with an organization. University of Colorado did a fantastic thing. They did simple air filtration and ventilation pre-vaccination, reduced infection rates. But during the fires that were around in Colorado, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the university campus was the only place that people could congregate to get clean air. So, if you adopt air filtration and ventilation, appeal to that selfish gene. Not only you're gonna be choke free when there's the next forest fire, and also they saw reduced rates of influenza and RSV infections, and so they had less sick time. So, you can appeal to businesses. Less people going off sick means more people at work, less sick pay, means great things to your bottom line. So you have to make what you're trying to advocate appealing to others. Think about what's important to them, because it's all with everybody, it's all about me. And so what you're trying to advocate for you as a long hauler, clean air, filtration, ventilation, you have to show it's important to others. So, okay, you don't believe in SARS-CoV-2, but you do believe in the flu, don't you? You do believe in RSV, you do believe in measles, all airborne. If you have proper air filtration and ventilation, you will clean the air of all of that. Okay, you don't believe in viruses and pathogens, but you do believe in smoke because you can see it. If you have air filtration and ventilation, you will have somewhere to breathe at the next forest fire that's happening in your area. Make it about them to get what you need.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's great advice. We're about at time for this, but I did want to elevate that people were talking a little bit about local publications in the chat, which I think is so important and something we really wanted to emphasize with this event. So I wanted to ask Tori, or if anybody else wants to just like quickly say something about that before we close out.
Yeah, I think local publications are fantastic, specifically for those kind of broader general interest awareness pieces. I think that they do like Stat generally does not publish pieces related to awareness days, weeks, and months. It's just sort of a thing about us. Local publications love those. So definitely keep that in mind. Google what their submission guidelines are now. If they don't have any available, check the newspaper masthead for an opinion editor, or some local publications are so small now they might not actually have an explicit person, but find some contact information, reach out. They would almost certainly love to hear from community members.
Amazing. Okay, so I think just to be mindful of everybody's time, we're gonna close out, but truly thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We really appreciated all your comments and questions and the discussion in the chat. Like I said, we're recording this, so we'll be posting it afterwards. And you can look out for more virtual events. We're planning to really do more of those this year. Um, Maybe on I don't know. We're looking for topics. So if you have particular suggestions or recommendations, feel free to reach out. We also just updated our pitch guidelines at the Sick Times in time for this event. So if you're pitching us, there's now some more updated info on our website. Yeah, Miles, anything else that I am forgetting?
No, just many thanks to our excellent guests. We are so grateful for your tips, for your experiences and knowledge on this topic. Thank you for spending your time and spoons with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. It's been really enjoyable. Thank you.